The radio crackle cut through the operations center like a blade through silk. 3 words spoken in a voice that had forgotten how to hope. "We're out of time." The Marine captain on the ground wasn't asking for help anymore. He was stating a fact, the way a man reads his own epitaph. Somewhere in the Helmand Valley, pinned between a cliff face and 200 meters of killing ground, 43 Marines were counting their last magazines. The Taliban had them triangulated, mortared, and patient. Close air support had been promised. Close air support had failed to arrive. The sun was setting, and everyone knew what darkness meant in that valley. At Bagram Air Base, 3 colonels stood around a digital map table with the blank expressions of men who'd already written the after-action report in their heads. The mission commander had the phone pressed so hard against his ear it left a red mark. He was arguing with someone at Kandahar about fuel calculations and risk assessments, his voice climbing half an octave with each sentence. Nobody wanted to say the obvious. They'd sent the wrong aircraft to the wrong valley at the wrong time, and now mathematics had caught up with hope. The fast movers had burned their fuel making high-altitude passes, dropping ordnance that looked impressive on targeting screens, but did nothing to the fighters hidden in cave networks. The Apache couldn't operate in that terrain at Duskroder. Wash would kick up dust clouds that turned pilots blind. They needed something slow, something that could see, something that could bring hell close enough to smell. They needed an A-10, but the only Warthog available had been grounded for hydraulic issues, or so they thought. The crew chief was drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago when he heard the turbines spool up. He actually dropped the cup, ceramic shattering on concrete, because he knew that sound. He knew every aircraft on this flight line, knew their maintenance schedules, knew which ones could fly and which ones were mechanical ghosts held together by paperwork and hope. Tail number 810964 shouldn't be making that sound, shouldn't be making any sound. The hydraulic lines were compromised, the entire starboard system reading red across the board. He ran toward the flight line, boots pounding tarmac, arm already raised to wave off whoever had made this catastrophic mistake. Then he saw who was in the cockpit. Captain Alina Volkov sat behind the canopy with her helmet on, visor down, running through her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this 300 times and knew exactly what each switch meant. The crew chief reached the aircraft as she was advancing the throttles, his protestations lost in the rising scream of twin TF-34 turbofans. She looked down at him, and even through the visor he could see her eyes. They weren't reckless. They weren't desperate. They were simply decided. She gave him a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carries no apology because it assumes none is needed. And then she was moving, the ugly gray jet lumbering forward with all the grace of a freight train that had learned to fly. The tower controller's voice came through clipped and official. "Hog 53, you are not cleared for departure. Acknowledge." Alina's thumb found the radio switch, her voice calm as morning coffee. "Tower 53, aircraft is mission capable. Marines are dying, I'm gone." She didn't wait for the response. The A-10 rolled onto the runway, turbines building that distinctive whine that sounds like industrial fury, and then she was accelerating, the jet clawing its way into Afghan air with the determination of something built to refuse elegance in favor of purpose. Behind her, the crew chief stood on the flight line with his hands still raised, watching the aircraft climb in a shallow bank toward the mountains. The maintenance logs in his other hand fluttered in the jet wash, pages turning to a report he'd have to write that would probably end someone's career. But right now, all he could think about was the fact that Captain Volkov had a 6-year-old daughter in base housing, a girl who drew pictures of airplanes in purple crayon and signed them, "Love, Emma." He thought about what it meant that this woman had just climbed into a partially broken attack jet to fly toward a valley that had already killed 2 aircraft today. He thought about courage, and what it costs, and whether the difference between heroism and suicide was just a matter of outcome. Then he walked back to operations to tell them what had happened, and to start the paperwork that would either make Alina Volkov a legend or a cautionary tale. In the air, Alina ran the numbers in her head. 40 minutes to the valley, maybe 20 minutes of station time with what fuel she had. Compromised hydraulics meant degraded flight controls, which meant every maneuver would require more muscle, more compensation. The A-10 could take punishment, could limp home on systems that would drop any other aircraft from the sky, but there were limits even to that resilience. Her hands moved across the cockpit with practiced efficiency, checking weapon systems, verifying targeting pod alignment, confirming that the GAU-8 Avenger 30mm rotary cannon had a full combat load. 4,200 rounds of depleted uranium, each one capable of turning an engine block into abstract art. She'd need every one. The sun was lower now, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of amber and shadow. Beautiful if you had the luxury of noticing beauty. Alina didn't. She was calculating angles and fuel burns, planning an approach that would bring her into the valley below ridgeline level, using terrain masking to avoid the same anti-aircraft fire that had damaged 2 jets already. The radio crackled with traffic from the operations center, voices trying to coordinate something, anything, to help those Marines. Someone mentioned another Apache flight launching from Kandahar, ETA 65 minutes. Someone else talked about redirecting an F-15 strike package currently hitting targets 40 miles north. All the words added up to the same conclusion: too late. Alina keyed her mic, cutting through the chatter with the flat authority of someone who'd stopped asking permission. Any station, Hog 5-3. I'm 12 minutes from target area. Ground commander, if you're listening, I'm your close air support. Start talking to me. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt longer. Then a new voice came through, rough with dust and exhaustion. Hog 5-3, this is Reaper 1-6 on the ground. You're telling me you're 12 minutes out. Alina checked her navigation display, adjusted for wind. Affirm, Reaper. 11 minutes now. Tell me what you're facing. The Marine captain's voice carried the weight of a man who'd stopped believing in miracles and was now being asked to reconsider. We're pinned in a box canyon, walls on 3 sides, hostiles with clear fields of fire from elevated positions. We've got wounded. We've got limited ammunition. And we've got maybe 30 minutes before they're close enough to overrun our position with small arms. Alina processed this, visualizing the terrain from intelligence briefings and previous missions in the area. Understood. I'll approach from the southwest, use the ridge as cover. When you hear me, mark your position with smoke. The valley opened up before her like a wound in the earth, steep walls throwing shadows that turned the ground into a patchwork of light and darkness. Perfect ambush terrain. Perfect place to die. Alina dropped lower, feeling the A-10 respond sluggishly to her inputs, the hydraulic degradation making itself known in the way the stick felt mushier, less precise. She compensated, muscle memory adjusting for the aircraft's injuries the way she'd learned to adjust for wind, for weight, for the 1,000 variables that separated controlled flight from ballistic trajectory. She could see smoke now, both the purple marker smoke from the Marine's position and the darker black plumes from burning equipment. Could see the muzzle flashes from multiple positions along the canyon walls where Taliban fighters had established overlapping fields of fire. Classic L-shaped ambush, executed with patience and discipline. Whoever was commanding those fighters knew their business. Alina's thumb caressed the weapon selector, cycling to guns. The A-10 was built around the GAU-8, a cannon so powerful that the aircraft was essentially an airframe attached to a gun rather than the other way around. She'd fired it hundreds of times in training, dozens in combat. She knew the sound it made, that distinctive buzzing roar that troops on the ground called the BRRRT, a sound that meant salvation if you were friendly and judgment if you weren't. She keyed the radio. Reaper 1-6, I'm visual on your smoke. Targets are 270 degrees from your position elevation. I'm coming in hot, danger close. Keep heads down. The Marine captain's response was immediate. Hog 5-3, we're way past danger close. Do what you need to do. Alina rolled the A-10 into a banking turn that brought her perpendicular to the canyon wall, lined up on the largest cluster of muzzle flashes. The targeting pipper settled, steadied. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 erupted with a sound like tearing metal, 65 rounds per second of depleted uranium cutting through the air at 3,500 feet per second. The cannon's recoil was noticeable even in an aircraft that weighed 23 tons, a sustained vibration that felt like controlled violence. The rounds impacted along the ridge line in a sequence of explosions that turned rock and earth and flesh into component atoms. She held the trigger for a 3-second burst, walked the fire across the entire enemy position, then pulled hard on the stick to break away from the canyon wall. The A-10 responded, but slowly, the damaged hydraulics making her work for every degree of bank angle. Below, the Taliban fighters who'd survived the first pass were scrambling, trying to reposition, some breaking cover to run for better positions. Mistake. Alina rolled back into the valley, came in from a different angle and fired again. This time she used the targeting pod to guide her, watching in infrared as heat signatures scattered and fell and sometimes simply ceased to exist. The GAU-8 was indiscriminate in its efficiency, turning human beings into heat blooms and then into cooling shapes that no longer moved. She felt nothing about this. Not pleasure, not regret, just the focused attention of someone solving a tactical problem with the tools available. The Marines needed these people to stop shooting. She was making that happen. Simple mathematics written in 30-millimeter rounds. On the ground, the Marines were experiencing something between awe and shock. The first burst had turned the world into thunder and dust, the pressure wave from the impacts rolling through the canyon like a physical thing. The second burst had finished what the first started, silencing positions that had been pouring fire down on them for the past 3 hours. In the sudden relative quiet, broken only by the receding turbine scream of the A-10, the Marine captain keyed his radio with hands that shook slightly. Hog 5-3, that's good effects on target. We've got breathing room. Alina was already scanning for secondary positions, for the fighters who'd learned to hide from air support, who knew that the first strike was just the beginning. Reaper, I'm seeing movement 400 meters northwest of your position. Multiple personnel, looks like they're trying to flank. She didn't wait for confirmation. Rolled back into attack geometry, selected Mavericks this time, locked the AGM-65 onto the largest heat concentration and fired. The missile came off the rail with a solid thunk, motor igniting in a trail of white smoke, tracking toward the target with the relentless patience of algorithmic guidance. It impacted 5 seconds later, and the entire northern approach to the canyon turned into an expanding fireball that rose high enough to be seen from Bagram. When the smoke cleared, there was no more movement. The radio crackled with multiple voices now, operations center trying to coordinate, other aircraft checking in, everyone suddenly very interested in the valley that had been written off as a lost cause 30 minutes ago. Through it all, Alina flew patterns around the Marines' position, a circular orbit that said clearer than words, "Nothing gets close, nothing gets through, not while I'm here." Her fuel gauge was dropping faster than she'd calculated. The damaged hydraulics were causing slight asymmetric drag, making the aircraft work harder to maintain flight, burning fuel she didn't have to spare. She did the math. 15 minutes of station time left, maybe 20 if she was willing to fly home on fumes and hope. She chose hope. Keyed the radio. "Reaper 1-6, what's your exfil situation?" The Marine captain's voice came back stronger now, like a man who'd remembered what breathing felt like. "Fast rope extraction. LZ is 2 clicks south. But we need time to move the wounded, and we need those hillsides clear." Alina checked her tactical display, marked the landing zone, plotted the routes the enemy would use if they were smart. "Copy. I'll cover your movement. Start moving." For the next 18 minutes, Alina turned the A-10 into an umbrella of violence, methodically clearing every position that could threaten the Marines' withdrawal. She used guns. She used remaining Mavericks. She used the aircraft itself as a psychological weapon, making low passes that broke windows of sound over enemy positions. Twice she took ground fire, heard the distinct snap-crack of rounds passing close to the canopy. The A-10's titanium bathtub around the cockpit was designed for exactly this, built to shrug off ground fire that would shred lighter aircraft. She felt some impacts, felt the aircraft shudder as something hit the fuselage, but everything kept working. Mostly. The starboard hydraulic pressure dropped another 5%. Flight controls got mushier. She compensated. Below, the Marines reached the landing zone, set up defensive positions while the CH-47 Chinook came in low and fast, flare heavy to shed altitude. The helicopter touched down for exactly 90 seconds, long enough to take on 43 Marines and their wounded, then pulled pitch and climbed out at maximum power. Alina orbited overhead, watching on her targeting pod as the Chinook gained altitude and distance, getting clear of the valley that had almost become a mass grave. Only when the helicopter was 10 miles away, safely out of range of anything short of a SAM system, did she turn the A-10 toward Bagram. Her fuel gauge read 20 minutes to flameout. Bagram was 27 minutes away. The math was not encouraging. The flight back was a study in precision fuel management. Alina pulled the throttles back to minimum sustainable thrust, let the A-10 descend gradually to find denser air that would give her slightly better efficiency. She disabled non-essential systems, anything that drew power from the engines. She flew the smoothest line possible, avoiding any maneuver that would require throttle adjustments. The sun had set fully now, turning the world below into shadows punctuated by occasional lights from compounds and villages. The cockpit instruments glowed softly, giving her face a green-tinted cast. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was even. She'd either make it back or she wouldn't, and her opinion on the matter was largely irrelevant at this point. The radio had been quiet for the last 10 minutes, everyone apparently deciding that silence was more helpful than chatter. Then the tower controller's voice came through, professional but with an edge that suggested he'd been doing his own calculations. Hog 53 Bagram Tower. Winds are 270 at 8 knots, altimeter 3012. You're cleared for straighten approach runway 21. Emergency equipment is standing by. Alina keyed her mic. Tower 53. Appreciate the hospitality. She didn't mention the fuel. Didn't mention that she was now gliding more than flying. Engines at idle thrust. The descending in a controlled fall toward a runway she could just barely see. Didn't mention that the hydraulic pressure had dropped to the point where landing was going to require physical strength she wasn't sure she had. The runway lights stretched out before her like a promise, twin rows of amber leading to a threshold that seemed both impossibly close and impossibly far. She configured for landing, gear down, flaps set, felt the aircraft slow and settle into that characteristic nose-high attitude. The A-10 didn't land gracefully. It arrived, with purpose and considerable mass. 200 feet. 150. Alina crossed the threshold at exactly the right altitude and airspeed, a testament to 3,000 hours of flight time and an understanding of her aircraft that went beyond technical knowledge into something like intuition. She pulled the throttles to idle, felt the main gear kiss concrete with a solid thump, then the nose gear as she let the aircraft settle. Applied brakes. The A-10 rolled out, slowing, the turbines winding down to silence. She turned off onto the taxiway, following the ground crew's signals to a parking spot and shut down the engines. In the sudden quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat. The canopy cracked open, letting in night air that smelled of jet fuel and dust. The crew chief was there, the same one who tried to wave her off 4 hours ago. He looked at her with an expression that mixed relief and exasperation and something else, something that might have been respect. Captain Volkov. That was the single most irresponsible thing I've seen in 20 years of Air Force service. Alina unstrapped from the ejection seat, every movement deliberate as adrenaline drained away and left her feeling hollowed out. Did the Marines make it out? The crew chief's expression softened slightly. All 43, 3 with serious wounds but all alive. Alina nodded, accepting this information the way you accept a weather report. Then I'd say my aircraft was mission-capable after all. She climbed down from the cockpit, boots hitting tarmac that still held the day's heat. Behind her, maintainers were already swarming the A-10, flashlights revealing the damage she'd taken. 3 rounds through the tail section. 2 through the port wing. One that had punched through a hydraulic line and somehow not caused catastrophic failure. just the slow bleed that had turned flying into a physical wrestling match. The aircraft had brought her home on backup systems and engineering margins, refusing to fail because failure wasn't in its design philosophy. The operations center was brightly lit, too many people moving too fast, all the controlled chaos of a mission that had gone wrong and then unexpectedly right. Colonel Marcus Reeves stood at the center of it, a man who'd spent 30 years making decisions that kept people alive and still looked surprised when someone decided to make those decisions without him. He saw Alina enter and his jaw tightened. "My office." Now. It wasn't a request. Alina followed him into the side office, stood at attention while he closed the door and turned to face her. For a long moment he just looked at her, and she could see him working through whatever he was going to say, trying to find words that captured both his anger and his relief. "Finally, you took an aircraft that was grounded, that was officially non-mission capable, and flew it into a combat zone without clearance, without authorization, without any backup or support. Do you understand that what you did violates approximately 15 different regulations?" Alina kept her eyes forward. "Yes, sir." Reeves's voice climbed half an octave. "Do you understand that if you'd been shot down, if that hydraulic line had failed completely, if any one of a dozen things had gone wrong, your daughter would be getting a folded flag instead of a mother?" And there it was, the real issue. Not the regulations, not the chain of command, but the fact that Alina had gambled with something that wasn't just hers to gamble with. She met his eyes now. "Sir, 43 Marines would be dead. I had a mission-capable aircraft and the skills to employ it. The math was simple." Reeves sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 56 years. The math, she says." He pulled out a folder, flipped it open. Inside were after-action reports, radio transcripts, and a handwritten note from the Marine captain on the ground. "You know what Captain Hernandez wrote? He said you saved his entire company. Said you flew like you were personally responsible for every one of their lives. Said you took fire and kept working the problem until they were safe." He looked up at her. "He also said he'd never heard of you before today, which makes two of us. 300 hours in the A-10, combat deployments to 3 theaters, but somehow you're flying out of Bagram as what, third-string close air support." Alina said nothing. There wasn't really anything to say. Reeves leaned back. "I did some research after you decided to make tonight interesting. You were at Creech before this, flying Predators. Before that, F-16s at Cunson. Before that, top of your class at undergraduate pilot training." He paused, watching her face for reaction. "You also have a daughter with special needs. Emma, right? 6 years old, high-functioning autism, requires specific educational support. The kind of support that's easier to access when you're assigned to bases with good facilities, which means accepting assignments that don't advance your career because they advance your daughter's life." Alina's jaw tightened fractionally. This wasn't information from her service record. This was someone digging into her life, her choices, the compromises she'd made between the pilot she was and the mother she needed to be. Reeves saw her reaction and raised a hand. "I'm not judging. I'm understanding. You're a better pilot than 90% of the people on this base, but you've spent 5 years taking assignments that kept you close to support networks instead of close to advancement. And now you're here, flying an aircraft you're overqualified for, being underestimated by people who don't know enough to know better." He closed the folder. "Well, after tonight, that's going to change. Those 43 Marines are alive because you made a choice. A choice that's going to generate paperwork and questions and probably a formal investigation. But they're alive. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to write a detailed after-action report. You're going to be available for every debrief and inquiry. And you're going to keep flying missions out of this base because, like it or not, you just proved that when everything goes wrong, you're exactly the kind of pilot we need." Alina remained at attention. "Yes, sir." Reeves's expression softened slightly. "How's Emma doing?" The question caught Alina off guard. She maintained composure. "She's good, sir. Made a friend on base. Starting to read above grade level." He nodded. "My youngest has ADHD. Different challenges, but I understand the math you're doing every day, Captain. the calculations that have nothing to do with fuel and weapons loads. He came around the desk. "You're dismissed. Go see your daughter, then get some sleep. And Captain," Alina paused at the door, "sir, what you did tonight, it was reckless and brilliant and probably both saved lives and shortened my own through stress. Don't make a habit of it, but if you ever need to make that kind of call again, I trust your judgment." Alina nodded once, turned, and left. The night air outside operations was cool, desert temperature dropping with the darkness. She stood for a moment, letting her body remember what it felt like to not be moving at 300 knots with people shooting at you. Her hands found her pockets, and she walked toward base housing, toward the small apartment where her daughter was probably already asleep, drawing papers scattered on the kitchen table, pictures of airplanes in impossible colors. The next morning, word had spread. Not officially, not through command briefings or formal communications, but through the network of stories that military people tell each other when something happens that defies the usual categories. The single mom who flew a broken jet into hell and brought everyone home. By the time Alina walked into the squadron briefing room, conversation stopped. People looked at her differently. Not with mockery, not with the subtle dismissiveness that had followed her for months, but with something between curiosity and respect. The mission brief was routine, updates on threat assessments and new intelligence. But afterward, 3 different pilots approached her, asking technical questions about the A-10's degraded flight characteristics, about her approach profile, about how she'd managed fuel on the return leg. She answered directly, without false modesty or embellishment. The aircraft had performed. She'd performed. The mission had succeeded. These were facts, not stories. Captain Jake Morrison, an F-16 pilot who'd previously treated her with polite indifference, lingered after the others left. "That thing you did last night, we're all hearing different versions. What actually happened?" Alina considered how much to say. "Marines were pinned. I had capability they needed. I provided it." Morrison laughed, short and sharp. "That's the most boring description of heroism I've ever heard." He got serious. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I understood what you were doing here. You're clearly overqualified for the missions they've been giving you. But after last night, I think people are going to start paying attention. About time." He left, and Alina was alone in the briefing room with her coffee and her thoughts. She didn't feel like a hero. Didn't feel like she'd done anything except make the only logical choice available. The Marines needed help. She could provide help. Everything else was just variables and execution. But she understood what Morrison was really saying. She'd been invisible until she'd made herself impossible to ignore. Her phone buzzed. Text from the base childcare center. Emma had a great morning. She helped the other kids with their drawing project. So proud of her. Alina allowed herself a small smile. That was the math that mattered. Not the fuel calculations or the weapons geometry, but the fact that her daughter was thriving, was making friends, was building a life that gave her joy. Everything Alina did, every compromise and sacrifice and tactical decision, traced back to that simple mission: keep Emma safe and happy and growing. The broken jet, the hostile valley, the math that didn't quite add up, those were just problems to solve in service of the only objective that truly mattered. 3 days later, the formal inquiry began. Alina sat across a conference table from 2 lieutenant colonels and a civilian contractor from the inspector general's office, answering questions about decision matrices and risk assessment, and whether she'd fully considered the implications of taking an aircraft that was officially grounded. She answered each question directly, without defensiveness or elaboration. Yes, she'd known the aircraft had hydraulic issues. Yes, she'd assessed the risk. Yes, she'd understood she was violating multiple regulations. And yes, she'd make the same choice again under the same circumstances. The IG contractor, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Captain Volkov, help me understand your mindset. You have a young daughter who depends on you, yet you chose to fly an aircraft with known mechanical issues into a high-threat environment. How do you reconcile those facts?" Alina met her gaze. "I reconcile them by understanding that 43 other mothers and fathers and daughters and sons would be dead if I'd chosen differently. My responsibility to Emma includes teaching her that some things matter more than personal safety. That competence carries obligation. That when you have the ability to help and choose not to, you bear responsibility for the outcome. The IG contractor made a note, her expression unreadable. That's a very principled position. Alina said nothing. Principled wasn't the word she'd use. Necessary, maybe. The inquiry lasted 4 hours. At the end, the senior lieutenant colonel closed his notebook and looked at her with an expression that might have been grudging admiration. Captain, your actions violated regulations but saved lives. The official finding will reflect both of those facts. Expect a reprimand in your service record. Also expect a commendation for valor. Somehow you've managed to earn both simultaneously. He stood, signaling the inquiry was complete. Dismissed. Alina walked out into afternoon sunshine, feeling the weight of institutional judgment settle somewhere between vindication and censure. The reprimand would affect her promotion timeline, might close certain career paths. The commendation would open others. The net result was unclear but also irrelevant. She hadn't made her choice based on career calculus. She'd made it because Marines were dying, and she had the ability to change that fact. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Volkov. A rough voice came through, the kind that carried miles of hard experience. Captain Volkov, this is Captain Mike Hernandez, USMC. I'm the guy whose life you saved 3 days ago. Alina stopped walking. Captain Hernandez, glad you made it out. Made it out is a hell of an understatement. Ma'am, I need you to understand something. My Marines and I were writing our last letters. We were saying goodbyes on encrypted text messages. We were done, and then you showed up in that ugly-ass airplane and turned the entire situation around. His voice caught slightly. I've got 3 guys who would be dead right now if you'd been 5 minutes slower. I've got a 22-year-old corporal who's going to see his newborn daughter because you didn't quit when that hydraulic line started failing. Alina didn't know what to say to that. Hernandez continued. I'm calling because I wanted you to hear this from me, not through official channels. I recommended you for the Navy Cross. I don't care that you're Air Force. I don't care about inter-service politics. What you did was beyond valor. It was professional perfection under conditions that would break most pilots. You deserve recognition. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. Alina felt something tighten in her chest. Captain, I appreciate that, but I was doing my job. Your job was grounded maintenance. You chose to make it something else. Ma'am, with respect, take the gratitude. You earned it in ways I hope you never have to understand from the receiving end. They talked for a few more minutes, Hernandez sharing details about his Marine's recovery, about the extraction that had worked because she'd kept the enemy suppressed, about the after-action brief where his commanding officer had asked who the hell flew that A-10 and why they weren't hearing more about this pilot. When the call ended, Alina stood in the middle of the base sidewalk, phone in hand, feeling the strange disconnect between what she'd experienced tactical problem-solving under pressure and what others had experienced, which was apparently something closer to salvation. That night, she sat on her apartment floor with Emma, building with blocks while her daughter explained the structural engineering behind her castle design with the intense focus that characterized her engagement with things she found interesting. Emma looked up, purple crayon in hand. Mommy, did you really fly through explosions? Alina paused. She'd been careful about what she shared, but base housing was small and kids heard things. Something like that. How did you hear about that? Emma returned to her drawing. Jessica's mom said you're a hero, that you saved a lot of people. Are you a hero? The question hung in the air with the weight of parental responsibility. Alina chose her words carefully. I'm a pilot who made a choice to help people who needed help. Whether that makes me a hero is something other people decide. What matters to me is that I did what I thought was right and that I came home safe to you. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. I think you're a hero, but also I'm glad you came home. She held up her drawing. It showed an airplane, rendered in purple and gold, with exaggerated wings and what might have been explosions or might have been fireworks in the background. At the bottom, in careful letters, My mom is brave. Alina felt her throat tight. She pulled her daughter close. Thank you, sweetheart. That's the most important medal anyone could give me. 2 weeks later, the story had traveled beyond Bagram. A journalist embedded with Marine units heard about the rescue and started asking questions. Then a combat photographer who'd been with the extraction helicopter shared images of the making low passes over the valley, the distinctive shape silhouetted against the sunset. Then someone leaked the radio communications, and suddenly people were listening to Alina's calm voice, coordinating the rescue while her aircraft was taking ground fire. The story hit social media with the force of a cultural moment. People who'd never heard of the A-10 Warthog were suddenly experts on close air support. People who couldn't find Afghanistan on a map were sharing the radio recordings and calling Alina a hero. The headline that gained the most traction was almost poetic in its simplicity. Even the Marines lost hope when the single mom's A-10 returned, fuel pouring out. It wasn't entirely accurate. The fuel hadn't been pouring out. It had been draining from damaged lines at a measurable but not catastrophic rate. But accuracy mattered less than narrative, and the narrative of a single mother risking everything to save troops in contact resonated across demographics and political divides. Alina watched her phone fill with interview requests and ignored them all. She hadn't done this for publicity. She'd done it because Marines were dying and she had a solution. The attention felt like a distraction from the actual work, which continued regardless of social media engagement metrics. But the attention had consequences. The Air Force, suddenly aware that one of their pilots had become a viral sensation, had to decide how to respond. They could downplay it, treat it as an aberration, return Alina to her normal rotation of underwhelming missions. Or they could lean into it, use her story to highlight the service's capabilities and the competence of their pilots. They chose a middle path, cautious acknowledgement. Alina was featured in an official Air Force publication with a carefully worded article that emphasized her training and the capabilities of the A-10 platform. She was asked to participate in a recruiting video, which she declined. She was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy, which she accepted only because they agreed she could focus on tactical decision-making rather than inspirational platitudes. Through it all, she kept flying. The missions were more visible now, with more scrutiny, but the work remained the same: provide close air support, protect ground forces, bring everyone home. The difference was that people now watched how she worked. Young pilots started asking questions about her techniques, her approach profiles, her fuel management strategies. She became, without seeking it, an informal mentor to the pilots who wanted to be better at the tactical details that separated competence from excellence. Captain Morrison, the F-16 pilot, approached her one morning at the flight line. "There's talk about standing up a new CAS training program at Nellie's. They're looking for experienced pilots to develop curriculum. Your name came up." Alina was checking weather reports on her tablet. "I'm not interested in a training slot." Morrison pressed, even if it meant better facilities for Emma. Nellie's is 20 minutes from excellent special education resources, state-of-art stuff that would make Bagram look like the Dark Ages. Alina looked at him sharply. "How do you know about Emma's needs?" He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Word gets around. Look, I'm not trying to manipulate you, but you've been making career decisions based on her needs for 5 years. Maybe this is a decision where her needs and your capabilities actually align. You'd be teaching the next generation of CAS pilots. That matters. And you'd be doing it from a place where she'd have access to resources that could help her thrive." Alina returned to her weather report, but the thought had lodged itself in her mind. A training position would mean fewer deployments, more stability, and yes, better educational resources. It would also mean stepping back from operational flying, from the missions that had defined her identity for the past decade. She'd have to decide what mattered more, the flying or the legacy. That night she talked to Emma about it, explained in age-appropriate terms that they might move to Nevada, to a new school, new opportunities. Emma's response was characteristically direct. "Will there be other kids like me there?" Alina pulled up the website for the special education programs near Nellie's, showed her daughter the photos of engaged students, diverse learning approaches. Yes, sweetheart. Lots of other kids who think like you do. Emma studied the images with focused attention. Okay, we can move, but you have to promise you'll still tell me about flying. Alina made the promise, knowing that whatever decision she made about her career, whatever path she chose, it would be measured against one simple metric. Was Emma safe, happy, growing? Everything else was negotiable. She called Morrison the next day. Tell whoever's organizing that training program that I'm interested, but I have conditions. I want input on curriculum design. I want to make sure we're teaching pilots to actually help people, not just execute procedures. And I want flexibility for family needs. Morrison sounded pleased. I'll pass that along. For what it's worth, I think you'll be good at this. You're already teaching people whether you mean to or not. 3 months later, Alina stood in her new apartment in Las Vegas, boxes stacked in corners, Emma exploring rooms with the careful curiosity she brought to new environments. Through the window, she could see Nellie's Air Force Base in the distance, the flight line visible as a shimmer of heat and distant aircraft. Her new assignment started in a week. She'd be teaching young pilots the tactical nuances of close air support, the decision-making processes that separated adequate from exceptional, the understanding that every choice in the cockpit had consequences measured in lives rather than abstract metrics. It was different from operational flying, from the adrenaline of combat missions, from the immediate satisfaction of solving problems with weapons and airspeed. But it was important, maybe more important in the long run than any single mission. She'd be multiplying her competence, creating dozens of pilots who understood that their job was about keeping people alive, about making impossible choices with incomplete information, about refusing to quit when math and mission collided. Emma appeared at her side, holding a picture she'd drawn on the flight to Nevada. I put this in my new room, so I remember. The drawing showed two airplanes, one large and one small, flying side by side. The large one was gray and angular, clearly an A-10. The small one was purple and fantastical, a child's interpretation of flight that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with imagination. Between them, Emma had written, "Heroes fly together." Alina felt emotion rise in her throat, pushed it down with practiced control. That's beautiful, sweetheart. What does it mean? Emma explained with the patient tone she used when adults didn't understand obvious things. The big plane is you. The small plane is me. We both fly just different ways, but we're together. And there it was. The entire mission statement of Alina's life, rendered in purple crayon by a 6-year-old with more emotional intelligence than most adults. They were flying together, through different skis, facing different challenges, but always within sight of each other. That was the objective. That was the definition of success. Alina hung the picture on her bedroom wall where she'd see it every morning before leaving for Nellie's, every evening coming home. A reminder that heroism wasn't about singular acts of valor, but about sustained commitment to the people who depended on you, about choosing to keep flying even when the hydraulics were failing and the math didn't add up. The training program started with 28 pilots, most of them young and confident in the way people are when they haven't yet encountered situations that exceeded their training. Alina stood in front of them in the briefing room, no notes, no slides, just her flight suit and 3,000 hours of experience. Close air support is about one thing, keeping ground forces alive. Everything else, the tactics, the weapons, the radio procedures, serves that single objective. You're not here to be fighter pilots who occasionally help people. You're here to become experts in applied violence in service of protection. She clicked to a video grainy combat footage from the Valley Rescue. They watched the making passes, the GAU-8 impacts, the methodical destruction of enemy positions. When it ended, she faced them. That mission succeeded because I understood what the Marines needed and refused to accept the constraints that would have prevented me from providing it. Some of those constraints were legitimate aircraft maintenance, fuel calculations, authorization. Some were cultural assumptions about what a single mother flying third-string CAS could accomplish. She paused. Let that sink in. Your job is to develop judgment about which constraints are real and which are just friction, to understand when following regulations serves the mission, and when the mission requires you to find creative solutions within legal and ethical boundaries, and to never, ever let someone die because you were afraid of being unconventional. A lieutenant in the front row raised his hand. "Captain, with respect, you're teaching us to break rules." Alina smiled, sharp. "I'm teaching you to understand why rules exist, which ones protect lives and which ones protect careers, and how to make decisions when those things conflict. I'm teaching you to be dangerous in the ways that matter and disciplined in the ways that keep people alive. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they're not. Judgment is knowing the difference." The training program became known, unofficially, as Volkov's Gauntlet, not because it was physically demanding, though it was, but because Alina had a talent for creating scenarios that tested decision-making under pressure, for putting pilots in situations where every choice had consequences, and some consequences were permanent. She used simulators that incorporated random failures, degraded systems, unclear intelligence. She brought in ground commanders to explain what close air support looked like from the receiving end, what it meant when pilots showed up or didn't, when they were effective or just loud. She made her students write essays about risk assessment, about the ethics of weapons employment, about what they owed to the people on the ground beyond professional competence. The pilots who came through Volkov's Gauntlet emerged different, more thoughtful, more aware of the weight of their decisions, more willing to ask hard questions about mission planning and risk acceptance. They also flew better because Alina taught techniques that weren't in the manual, approaches to fuel management and weapons employment that came from experience rather than doctrine. 6 months into the program, a colonel from Air Combat Command visited to assess the curriculum. He sat through a full day of training, watching Alina work with students, observing simulator sessions, reviewing the after-action discussions. At the end, he pulled her aside. "Captain Volkov, this is not what I expected." Alina kept her expression neutral. "Sir." He gestured toward the briefing room where students were debriefing their last sim session. "I expected a basic CAS course with some personal flair. What you've built is a graduate-level program in tactical decision-making that happens to use close air support as the framework. These pilots are learning to think, not just fly." He looked at her directly. "The Air Force needs more of this. I'm recommending we expand the program, make it mandatory for all pilots transitioning to CAS roles, which means you'd be in charge of a significantly larger operation. More staff, more resources, more visibility. You interested?" Alina considered the question, weighed it against her primary mission. "Does more resources include support for dependent family members with special needs?" The colonel looked surprised by the question but recovered quickly. "It can. What do you need?" "Liaison with local school districts, flexibility for parent-teacher conferences and medical appointments, understanding that some days I'll need to leave exactly on time, not when the mission's done." He nodded slowly. "That's unusually specific but entirely reasonable. Consider it done." Alina extended her hand. "Then yes, sir. I'm interested." The expanded program launched 8 months later with 40 students per cycle and a staff of 6 instructors, all handpicked by Alina for their combination of tactical experience and teaching ability. They moved into a new facility at Nellie's with advanced simulators, briefing rooms equipped with combat footage analysis tools, and direct links to ground units who could provide real-time scenarios. Alina became known as the architect of a revolution in how the Air Force thought about close air support, shifting from a platform-centric model to an effects-centric approach that prioritized ground force outcomes over flight time metrics. But she remained, fundamentally, a pilot who'd made a choice in a valley in Afghanistan and built everything else around the lessons of that choice. Articles appeared in professional military journals analyzing her methods. Her radio communications from the Valley Rescue became case studies at the Air Force Weapons School. Young pilots showed up at Nellie's hopping to learn from the woman who'd become a symbol of competence under pressure, of refusing to accept defeat when lives were at stake. Through it all, Alina maintained the same steady focus she'd brought to every mission. Understand the objective, assess available resources, execute with precision, evaluate results, adjust as needed. Whether she was teaching pilots or raising her daughter, the methodology remained consistent. One evening, 2 years after arriving at Nellie's, Alina attended Emma's school science fair. Her daughter had built a project about aerodynamics, complete with hand-drawn diagrams explaining lift and thrust and drag. The presentation was characteristically thorough, with Emma explaining concepts to judges with the same focused intensity she brought to everything that interested her. One of the judges, a retired aerospace engineer, was visibly impressed. "Young lady, this is exceptional work. Have you thought about becoming a pilot someday?" Emma looked at her mother, then back at the judge. "Maybe, but I think I'd rather design airplanes than fly them. My mom's really good at flying. I want to be really good at something different." The judge smiled. "That's a very mature perspective." After the fair, walking to their car under Nevada stars, Emma slipped her hand into Alina's. "Mommy, is it okay that I don't want to be a pilot? I know flying is really important to you." Alina stopped, knelt down to her daughter's eye level. "Emma, what's important to me is that you find something you love and become excellent at it. Whether that's designing airplanes or teaching or anything else. The flying was never the point. The point was doing work that mattered, that helped people, that used my abilities fully. If you find that in engineering, that's perfect." Emma hugged her, fierce and sudden. "I want to help people like you do, just with math instead of airplanes." Alina held her daughter, feeling the full weight of what they'd built together. A life that balanced demanding careers with family needs. A relationship that honored both ambition and connection. A model of what it meant to be competent and caring, driven and present, exceptional and human. The next morning, Alina stood in front of a new class of pilots, their faces eager and uncertain in equal measure. She looked at them and saw the future of close air support, the next generation of pilots who'd face impossible choices and unclear situations, and ground forces who needed help right now, not after proper channels were consulted. "Before we start tactical training," she began, "I want you to understand something fundamental. You're not here to be heroes. You're here to be so professionally competent that heroism becomes unnecessary. The goal is to make hard things look easy, to solve problems before they become crises, to be so reliable that ground commanders don't need miracles because they have you." She paused, meeting eyes around the room. "But sometimes competence looks like courage. Sometimes being professional means making choices that scare you. Sometimes the right answer isn't in the manual, and you have to write your own based on principles rather than procedures." She clicked to the first slide, a tactical map of the valley where she'd flown 2 years ago. "Let me tell you about a mission where Marines were dying, hydraulics were failing, and math suggested I couldn't make it home. Let me tell you about the choices I made, the risks I accepted, and why I'd make the same decisions again. And then let's talk about how we prepare you to face your own version of that valley, your own impossible math, your own moment when someone's life depends on your judgment." The students leaned forward, ready to learn. Alina began to teach. Years passed. The program expanded. Pilots trained by Alina deployed to conflicts around the world, bringing her methodologies to ground forces who needed support. Their after-action reports frequently noted the same qualities: tactical flexibility, creative problem-solving, absolute commitment to protecting ground forces, and a willingness to take calculated risks when the mission required it. They became known, collectively, as Volkov's disciples, though Alina disliked the term. She hadn't trained disciples. She trained professionals who understood that competence was a form of care, that excellence in tactics was how you honored the people who depended on you, that every choice in a cockpit had moral weight even when the mathematics were purely technical. Emma grew older, moved from elementary to middle school, her interests solidifying around aerospace engineering. She excelled in mathematics and physics, showed the same focused intensity her mother brought to flight planning. She was designing aircraft on computer programs by age 12, creating theoretical models that optimized for efficiency and capability in equal measure. Mother and daughter developed a routine of discussing their work over dinner, Alina sharing tactical problems while Emma explained engineering challenges. Their conversations were technical and deep, each learning from the other's perspective, each appreciating how different types of expertise approached problem solving. Alina was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. She turned down command positions that would have taken her away from the training program, choosing to remain where she could directly influence the next generation of pilots. Her superiors eventually understood. She'd found her mission, and it wasn't about rank or advancement but about multiplying her impact through teaching. The A-10 she'd flown in Afghanistan, tail number 810964, was eventually retired from active service. In a small ceremony, they transferred it to the Air Force Museum, parking it in the modern flight gallery with a placard that read, "This A-10 Thunderbolt II was flown by Captain Alina Volkov during a 2023 mission to rescue 43 Marines under heavy fire in Afghanistan. Despite hydraulic damage and fuel concerns, Captain Volkov provided close air support that enabled successful extraction of all personnel." The mission exemplifies the A-10's durability and the skill of the pilots who fly it. Alina attended the ceremony with Emma, now 13 and taller than her mother. They stood in front of the aircraft, and Emma reached out to touch the titanium skin that had carried her mother through fire. "It doesn't look that impressive," Emma observed. Alina smiled. "That's what makes it perfect. The A-10 was never about looking impressive. It was about doing the job, surviving, bringing the pilot home. Function over form, reliability over flash." Emma nodded, understanding. "Like you." The simple observation carried weight. Alina had never sought recognition, never promoted her story, never used her moment of viral fame for personal advancement. She'd simply continued doing work that mattered, raising her daughter, teaching pilots, living a life defined by competence and care rather than image and acclaim. But the story persisted. The Valley Rescue became case study material at military academies, featured in documentaries about air power, referenced in discussions about courage and decision-making under pressure. Alina remained reluctant participant in this narrative, giving interviews only when she could shape them toward lessons rather than personality, toward tactical principles rather than emotional impact. In one interview with a military history publication, the journalist asked about the moment she decided to take the damaged A-10 into combat. Alina was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I didn't decide in a moment. I'd been deciding my entire career, every time I chose competence over comfort, every time I practiced emergency procedures one more time, every time I studied tactics beyond what was required." The Valley wasn't a decision. It was the culmination of 10,000 small choices to be ready for a moment I hoped would never come. The journalist pressed, "But weren't you afraid? Knowing the risks, knowing you had a daughter who needed you." Alina's expression grew thoughtful. "Fear is just information. It tells you what's at stake. The question isn't whether you feel fear but what you do with that information. I was afraid. I was also competent. I let competence guide my actions while acknowledging fear as valid data about consequences." She leaned forward slightly. "The real question isn't about fear or courage, it's about obligation. I had unique capability at a critical moment. Choosing not to act would have been choosing to let people die. That's not a morally neutral position. Inaction has consequences just as real as action. I chose the consequences I could live with." The interview ran with the headline, "Alina Volkov on courage. Competence is how you honor obligation." It was shared widely in military circles, became required reading in several leadership development programs, influenced how people thought about the relationship between skill and ethics. Alina read it once, decided it was accurate enough, and returned to work. She had a new class of pilots to train, curriculum to refine, a daughter who needed help with a college application essay. The story was just a story. The work continued. When Emma was 17, she was accepted to MIT's aerospace engineering program with a full scholarship. The acceptance letter mentioned her application essay about growing up with a mother who taught me that excellence is a form of love, and that the best way to honor people is to be so good at what you do that you can help them when it matters most. At the small celebration in their apartment, Emma showed her mother the acceptance letter. "I wrote about you, about what you taught me. Hope that's okay." Alina felt emotion rise, controlled it. "It's perfect. I'm so proud of you." Emma hugged her. "I'm going to design aircraft that make pilots like you even better. That's how I want to help people." And there it was. The mission successful, the objective achieved. Alina had raised a daughter who understood that competence mattered, that excellence was ethical, that the best way to live was in service of making other people's lives better. Everything else, the medals, the recognition, the viral fame was just noise around the essential signal. Be good at what you do, care about who you're helping, refuse to quit when things get hard. Alina's last year of active duty before retirement was marked by a ceremony she didn't want but couldn't avoid. The Secretary of the Air Force presented her with the Distinguished Flying Cross, recognition for the Valley rescue that had occurred 12 years earlier. The citation read in part, "For heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Captain Volkov's superior airmanship and devotion to duty reflected great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force." She stood at attention while they read the citation, while they pinned the medal to her dress uniform, while cameras flashed and people applauded. Emma stood in the audience, 24 years old now and working on her master's degree, designing next-generation aircraft that incorporated lessons learned from conflicts her mother had fought in. After the ceremony, they walked together across Nelly's, the sun setting over mountains that had watched Alina train thousands of pilots over the years. Emma broke the silence. "How does it feel, getting recognized after all this time?" Alina considered the question. "Unnecessary but appreciated. The recognition doesn't change what happened, doesn't make those Marines any more alive than they already were. But if it helps people understand what close air support means, what pilots can do when they're properly trained and supported, then it serves a purpose beyond my feelings about it." Emma smiled. "You're impossible to celebrate. You know that, right?" Alina returned the smile. "I'm just clear about what mattered. The work mattered. The outcome mattered. The recognition is nice, but it's not why I did it." They reached the flight line, where a new generation of A-10s sat ready for their next missions. Uglier than ever, reliable as dawn, built to bring pilots home from situations that would kill anything prettier. Alina looked at them with something like affection. The aircraft that had defined her career, that had carried her through fire, that had proven that function mattered more than form, and that surviving was its own kind of elegance. She thought about the crew chief who tried to wave her off 12 years ago, who'd later become one of her closest friends, who'd retired last year with stories about the craziest pilot he'd ever known, and the night she'd made him believe in both miracles and engineering margins. She thought about Captain Hernandez, the Marine she'd saved, who'd sent her a card every year on the anniversary of the rescue, always with the same message: "Still alive thanks to you." She thought about the 43 Marines who'd gone home, who'd lived entire lives that wouldn't have existed if she'd made different choices. Some had kids now. Some had started businesses. One had become a teacher. They lived in different states, pursued different dreams, but they shared the same alternative timeline where they died in an Afghan valley because help hadn't come. She'd prevented that timeline, given them the gift of continued existence. That was the math that justified everything else. Emma's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, what are you thinking about?" Alina pulled herself back to the present. "Just counting what mattered, making sure the ledger balanced." Emma understood. She always understood. They walked back toward the parking lot, toward their separate lives that remained connected by something deeper than routine. A bond forged through years of shared challenges, mutual support, and the understanding that excellence was how you showed love. Behind them, the sun finished setting over Nelly's, painting the aircraft in shades of amber and shadow. The A-10 sat ready for whatever came next, patient and ugly and absolutely reliable. Just like the woman who'd proven what they could do in the hands of someone who refused to quit. Just like the legacy she'd built through 10,000 choices to be competent, to care, to keep flying even when the hydraulics failed and the math didn't add up. The story ended the way all true stories end, not with a conclusion but with continuation. Alina retired from the Air Force but remained connected to the program she'd built, mentoring instructors, refining curriculum, ensuring that the lessons she'd learned in that valley continued to inform how pilots were trained. Emma graduated, took a position designing next-generation close air support aircraft, incorporating her mother's feedback about what pilots actually needed versus what looked good in presentations. The valley in Afghanistan, meanwhile, returned to its usual business of being strategically insignificant terrain that occasionally became critical for reasons that had nothing to do with its inherent value. Other missions were flown there. Other pilots made difficult choices. The cycle of conflict continued with its own remorseless logic. But on one wall at Nellie's, in the closed air support training building, there hung a photograph. It showed an A-10 in flight, low over mountainous terrain, the distinctive airframe silhouetted against a sunset that turned the sky into fire. Below the image, a quote, "Excellence is how we honor the people who depend on us. Competence is our gift to those who need us most. When we refuse to quit, we give others the chance to keep living. This is the obligation of every pilot who flies in support of ground forces. This is the standard we maintain not because it's easy but because lives depend on it." There was no attribution. None was needed. Everyone who walked through that building knew whose words they were, whose mission they described, whose standard they represented. And in apartments and houses scattered across the country, 43 people lived their lives, raised their children, pursued their dreams, sometimes thinking about the night they'd almost died in a valley in Afghanistan and the sound of turbines overhead that meant someone had refused to let them go. They'd never met Alina. Most didn't even know her name. But they were alive because she'd made a choice, because she'd been competent, because she'd understood that obligation doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for perfect conditions. They were her legacy, more real than any medal, more meaningful than any headline, more important than any story told about courage and hydraulic systems and fuel that didn't quite add up but somehow lasted long enough to matter. That was the math that balanced. That was the mission accomplished. That was why the story endured.